If you care about real history, not the polished museum version, but the hard-earned knowledge that kept ordinary people alive during extraordinary times, then this channel is for you, and you should subscribe now. What you are about to hear comes straight from the lived experience of civilians and soldiers during World War II, when supply lines collapsed, ration cards ran thin, and survival depended on noticing what others walked past. This is not romantic folklore. This is applied historical knowledge tested under pressure that still works today. Stay with me for the next minute, because what follows may permanently change how you see landscapes, cities, and even your own backyard. During the war, hunger was not theoretical. It was daily, grinding, and unforgiving. Across Europe, Asia, and occupied territories, people survived not because help arrived on time, but because they learned to extract food from unexpected places. Ditches, bombed lots, hedgerows, canals, rail embankments, and urban rubble became lifelines. Governments quietly circulated foraging manuals, while families passed down knowledge verbally to avoid confiscation or punishment. Much of that knowledge never made it into official histories. Today, we are going to recover it. One of the most important lessons from World War II foraging is psychological rather than botanical. People had to unlearn the idea that food only comes from farms and shops. In occupied France, Poland, and parts of Britain under rationing, civilians learned to see calories instead of scenery. Nettles were no longer weeds, but vitamin-rich greens. Acorns were not forest litter, but starch reserves. This mental shift happened fast because starvation accelerates learning. You can apply this today by deliberately training your eye. When walking through your neighborhood, stop categorizing plants as decorative or wild. Instead, ask whether they are edible, medicinal, or useful for fuel. This habit, once formed, never leaves you, and that is exactly how wartime civilians adapted so quickly. Contrary to popular belief, cities were not dead zones for food. Wartime accounts from London, Berlin, and Warsaw describe extensive urban foraging. Bomb craters filled with rainwater created micro-wetlands where edible plants like watercress could grow. Railway lines, often left undisturbed, became long strips of wild greens and berries. Even rubble piles hosted mushrooms after rain. The practical application here is understanding disturbed ground ecology. Areas humans abandon temporarily often become productive very quickly. If you are studying survival scenarios, learn to identify pioneer plants that thrive in poor soil. These were the first food civilians harvested after air raids, often within weeks. Protein was the hardest nutrient to replace during the war. Meat was scarce, livestock was requisitioned, and fishing was restricted. Civilians turned to sources modern people often dismiss. Snails, frogs, freshwater mussels, and even certain insects were documented food sources across occupied Europe and Southeast Asia. These were not desperation foods chosen blindly. People relied on existing folk knowledge that had simply fallen out of favour before the war. So, to apply this knowledge responsibly today, the key is really identification and preparation. Wartime manuals, always stressed boiling and thorough cooking, not as some old superstition, but as a way to prevent disease. If you're studying historical survival, you ought to also look at why certain methods were emphasized. Folks back then were responding to real outbreaks of illness under some pretty extreme conditions. Trees actually played a central role in Second World War foraging, and honestly, modern survival discussions often overlook that. Linden leaves, for example, were eaten fresh or dried. Pine needles were brewed into teas rich in vitamin C, which help prevent deficiency diseases. Acorns weren't just left on the ground, they were leached, ground and mixed with grain substitutes. And bark, when stripped properly, could provide emergency carbohydrates, all without killing the tree. So, the practical takeaway here is long-term sustainability. Wartime civilians, you see, understood that killing off a food source was really short-sighted. They harvested in ways that actually allowed for regrowth, because, well, survival wasn't just a weekend exercise, it was a multi-year reality. This mindset, honestly, is essential for anyone who's truly serious about survival history. Foraging, you know, was not only about getting enough calories, it was also an act of resistance. In occupied territories, people would plant edible plants right in plain sight, mixed in among ornamental gardens. They harvested wild foods quietly, trying to avoid detection. Knowledge itself, believe it or not, became contraband. Teaching a neighbour how to identify an edible root could, quite literally, mean the difference between survival and starvation. This all teaches us a powerful lesson about information as survival capital. In any crisis, those who know how to identify resources have an advantage that can't easily be confiscated. And, well, that's just as true now as it was back in 1943. WWII Foraging, honestly, is not about preparing for the past. It's about understanding just how fragile modern systems really are. The people who survived did so because they adapted faster than circumstances deteriorated. They didn't wait around for instructions. They observed, experimented carefully, and shared knowledge. Selectively, mind you. If you're a serious history buff or survivalist, study these practices not as curiosities, but as functional systems. Learn the plants, learn the methods, learn the mindset. That's how history stays alive and, well, genuinely useful. If you found this guide valuable, do subscribe to the Legacy of Survival channel, share this video with someone who truly respects real history, and help preserve knowledge that once kept millions alive and may very well do so again.